think that's what's overwhelming for many of us, is because learning how to grieve is the life skill that we've never been taught.
I'm Heather Grish, and this is the Wisdom of the Body podcast. This podcast explores the idea of body intelligence as the real key to learning the knowledge of life, or what we call Ayurveda in the ancient language of Sanskrit. We do that by connecting with today's creative leaders and experts who will help you listen to your body, trust your gut, and live in deeper harmony with nature. Come join me as we unlock the golden door to clear, direct perception and become very deep listeners. You can find the Wisdom of the Body podcast on Apple, Spotify, and Stitcher. You can also follow us by joining my email at heathergrish.com or on Instagram at heathergrish. I know you're going to love this podcast, so take a second right now to subscribe. Today, I'm here with AmarAtma, a grief coach with advanced certification as a grief recovery specialist. He has spent the better part of the last decade helping hundreds and thousands of grievers in both one-on-one private coaching, along with emotional and spiritual care as a board-certified chaplain in an acute care hospital setting. This is going to be a powerful talk today, AmarAtma. I already know it. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, great to be here with you, Heather. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Well, it's lovely and to see you and to talk with you. And I'm curious though, like, how does one find himself in this kind of work? What drew you to it?
It's actually something that I wasn't drawn towards. It almost found me, to be honest. I had just so many years of dark nights of the soul, existential style pain during my young years of my life, questioning the meaning and purpose of our existence, but not really having any space to sort of talk to anybody. I was kind of the oddball kid, and I just had that wound of wanting to understand what this life is about and what it means to be human, and asking these big why-oriented questions. And then just seeing people almost live with masks, not necessarily being themselves, and almost seeing beyond that mask and having a sense of a feel of who they were underneath it, and just not understanding, seeing the play of ego and playing the personas and so forth, and just really troubled by that for many years and feeling just that pain. And so it took me about 20 years to understand that what I was experiencing was grief. I was having this profound sense of loss. I had deaths and I had experiences of what we think of as a loss or grief, but my feeling was this sort of profound loss of identity. Being a South Asian man growing up in American style culture was a really big part of that process for me in my own personal formation. And then it took me about 10 years to really understand what grief was and kind of go into that trajectory. And there was very little resources. And even the books and the things that we have in research don't really speak to it in a heart-oriented way. And so it took me into really delving deep into it through my work in ministry and work in chaplaincy, acute care hospital settings, and working in trauma, working in the emergency department, and working in, the ICUs and end-of-life care and palliative care and oncology and in the psych units, and taking into just really deep excavation around people feeling their absolute worst, their most vulnerable, or the worst fears coming to life for people who had lost their loved ones in tragic and abrupt ways. And I found myself in the world and realm of grief. And I was like, okay. And I was finding myself there. It was very interesting. I was finding myself within the nature of the work. And I just started to study it deeper and deeper and have more time. And I started to understand more of my own grief journey and my own unresolved pain around grief. And I was good at it. I could play into the human nature and human conversation around it. I could tie in my Chinese medical background and organ system theories and energetic medicine, my background in yoga and meditation, my background in religious studies. I could tie in varying components that seemingly to be disparaging aspects of my life, my career, my professional development, and come into a whole place of seeing the root cause of so much pain and distress in our world is tied to, in part, and perhaps mainly due to, unresolved emotional pain due to loss and grief. And that became my jam. That became something that I worked with.
Wow. That became your jam. Grief became my jam.
Grief work became my jam. Absolutely, yeah. There's very much a human being underneath all this, like I think that one of the big things that I learned in chaplaincy, in my chaplain education, was reclaiming humanness as being a really, really important part of really developing inner peace. Inner peace is something that we all strive for. We all are called towards. We all are moving towards finding deeper joy and happiness and a sense of peace in our life. And in some ways, by the masks we wear, the personas we create, that what it looks like on social media and on Instagram, in some ways is not always authentic and real and vulnerable and intimate. And in some ways, reclaiming our humanness and the messiness and our idiosyncrasies and our imperfections are such an important part of our development and our growth in that way. And so that was it for me. I had my mask, my personas, my things I was projecting out. And when I started to really allow for those parts of me to just let it go, be chill, I'm a dude. I rollerblade, I eat pizza. Like, these are parts of my life that I like celebrate, and knowing that perfection is not at all what we're looking for, and which is one of the ways in which we get stuck in regards to a grief part of our story or part of our lives, where we are finding ways to cope with loss. Perfectionism becomes one of the ways we have to pay attention to as the areas of where we get stuck and prevents us from actually being able to grieve effectively.
Wow. There's so many ways that we could experience grief. And in your role as a chaplain and as a grief coach, are you mostly dealing with people who have lost someone in their lives, or a person who has lost something? Well, I guess it's the same thing. It's all loss, right? But is it typically people who've lost someone or people who've lost something else?
Originally, for me, in my work in chaplaincy, it was often around loss of a person and working with grievers, working with families, working with moms, working with spouses, working with children, working with varying components of family members. But interestingly, when we think about grief and loss, we often misunderstand it actually. We think that death of a person or maybe divorce as the two major losses that we have in our life, when in actuality, we have and can name over 40 different types of loss. So in the hospital setting, it actually transitioned very quickly, where my definition and understanding and awareness around grief expanded. I sat with a man who was shot by a stray bullet in his spine and was paralyzed, and he had a loss of vitality and a loss of his own youthfulness. He had been coming into the hospital because he has to go through 21 different styles of surgery because of wound care that he has to deal with, because of bed sores or sores that he has from being in the wheelchair for so long, and a loss of functionality in his life. So health related loss, or a person who was diagnosed with cancer but yet wasn't necessarily terminal and could be treated, but then there's a loss of hair and a loss of youthfulness or a loss of immune function. I worked in the transplant world, where I definitely was with the families whose loved one was deemed brain dead, and this hope and transformation of a loss, but then a gift that came with it, and the gift of giving life. But I worked on the other side of it, where somebody was receiving a life-saving organ like a kidney or a liver and spending time with them, but then this immune function shift happened. There's so many varying layers to it. People in healthcare, we experience a lot of loss financially as well. As one of the leading causes of bankruptcies is healthcare costs. There's a lot of questions and concern around wanting to go into a procedure that they might need, but not knowing that they can afford. And so there's a loss of certain components that exist there. So we have like the forms of death as loss, the financial components of loss, health related loss, education oriented loss, job career change losses, spiritual community oriented or religious community oriented loss, loss in a sense of intangible losses, loss of stability, loss of trust, loss of safety, loss of control. So, when I started to really work in the realm of grief, the I started to see that grief was everywhere all the time. And we're so unaware and miscategorize or misidentify grief as something else, but inherently it's coming with some form of a loss and pain of a loss that we rarely speak into. So, in some part, by being a grief coach or being a board certified chaplain, my job was to name the loss, name the grief that was there. And I started to see, by arriving into that space, we started to actually provide some profound relief, awareness, insight, realization, and thus movement within the pain to helping to have a transforming quality, or at least a presence to something else than the story or the incessant thoughts around what was happening that was about suppressing pain and keeping pain down and not actually being with what was existing. And so, yeah, there's many different forms of loss. And I saw that. And I work with varying as well. Obviously, I work with people who have, right now, in the acute care hospital setting in chaplaincy, it's very much like the acute. It's right there. And it's the varying kinds of loss. And working as a grief coach and doing one on one, it's sort of like the chronic grief experience. There's some acuity to it, but it's the long standing. My mom died 4 years ago. I'm feeling burnt out from my career. I'm in retirement. I had a major life event with a partner and we just broke up. And now we're in this process and I'm not able to find love again. I lost a partner. I'm trying to seek love and I'm really angry that I have to seek love again because I had lost my partner, and like this that becomes like the gamut of the work we do. And so part of it is educating people and sharing with them, hey, some of the pain that we might be feeling may be grief. Let's help with this because we can get movement, we can help, we can shift some of that.
There's something I find really ironic about this, which is that loss is not, I think, what a lot of people would think of as a pleasant emotion, like that there are pleasant emotions that we experience from loss. Although I did my master's thesis on fasting, so I would say that there's some understanding that, that's not always the case. But people are typically seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. There's a couple of topics that I've done on this podcast that I'm always like, oh man, am I going to feel like crap after talking about this? And like, how am I going to feel? And like worried that, oh, if I talk about this like negative, but just already being here with you and sort of coming to this reality of the fact that we all experience these things anyway, all the time, that there's something almost like weirdly empowering about just talking about it.
Oh, it totally is. And you know what? I resisted that for so many years too, though. Like, I'm just that same way. I felt like if I dive deep into my loss story or the pains that I've had or these emotions, that I was just going to collapse and fall into this well of depression and never come out. And I was so scared and so nervous. And, I didn't want to feel worse than what I was already feeling. And it's just totally the opposite, actually. When we can create space and shine a light on that dark, it's phenomenal. It's enriching. And the light that we've been trying to like go towards is almost a dim light compared to the light that exists within the dark. And my whole perspective has changed. It's not light and dark in that way. I feel like in some ways an advocate for grief because it's like, hey, we're looking for more joy. We're looking for more happiness. We're looking for more peace, more connection, more love, more sweetness and intimacy and vulnerabilities in our life, sense of aliveness. And these are the things that come from doing grief work. Fascinatingly, ironically, by arriving into it and having somebody who can hold that space and guide and support, then it's exquisite. Then it's like the life that we've always wanted to live can actually be a reality. Like it's that exquisite. And then I learned that, oh, we have a relationship to our doom, gloom, despair. We've coveted this relationship. We've cultivated this relationship. And people actually have a hard time with peace, joy, and happiness. They don't know it. They don't have a relationship to it. So a big part of my grief work is helping people come into a relationship of a comfortability with feeling good and feeling good on the regular, because we're scared the other shoe is going to drop. We're scared that it's just going to fall away, that it's some sort of magical, mystical thing that will just dissipate. And actually my reality is resigned and resentful and I don't even want it. And know that there's a sweetness and a richness. And I'm all about that because my slogan, my jam is world peace through inner peace. If we want to really create a world, I feel as an activator of helping to create a deeper place of the world being better with me being in it, then for me it's helping people find a deeper place of inner peace. And inner peace is coming through some of the stuff that we're carrying with us all the time and eclipsing our light, eclipsing love in our relationships, eclipsing pieces that we're wanting to find in our careers and our joy and our expression and our life meaning and purpose. And it's like, oh, I love this. This is, yes, that's what I want to do. That's who I am. That's what my purpose and my meaning is in this.
This may seem like a really stupid question, but I'm going to put it out there. And because I think a lot of people are really out of touch with their emotions these days. So if somebody were feeling grief, or if they were experiencing grief, what would they feel like in their body? What kind of thoughts would they have? So if you could kind of talk about this from the experience level of mind and body, how would someone know that they're experiencing grief? And maybe there's two questions here, actually maybe four, but, and then like, how would they know that they're not dealing with it?
Yeah. So grief is not an emotion. Grief is several emotions at the same time. Grief is the conflicting feelings that come with an end or change of a familiar pattern or behavior of our life. So that's what leads to the loss. It's the change or end of the familiarity. And it's the conflicting feelings that come in there. So grief is a process, it's a response, a natural and normal response to loss, but not solely an emotion. So grief comes with several emotions at the same time. And I think that's what's overwhelming for many of us, is because learning how to grieve is the life skill that we've never been taught. And part of what we're wanting to learn in grief and this life skill of grief is being able to be attuned to the several emotions that are existing in our heart at the same time. So there may be feelings of sadness and loneliness and weariness and woefulness, while at the same time some feelings of relief and perhaps gladness and maybe some gratitude. And that's very confusing for the mind. The mind likes things in black and white terms. It likes to label things. It likes to analyze and interpret and draw conclusions. And that's really, really weird for the heart to be able to exist in the space, and the mind has the interpretation. So the first phase of the grief work I offer for people is actually based on emotional resiliency. We can't think our way through grief. We have to feel our way through grief. And many of us don't really know how to feel. We don't know how to feel. And if I asked a person, if I asked you, if I asked any of my clients, I said, well, tell me how you feel about it. I might get 5 minutes of a whole description, and not one feeling will be expressed in there. Not one feeling would be shared in there. It'd be a lot of thoughts about that feeling.
That's why I asked about that, if you could talk about it from the mind level, because I agree.
Yeah, that's right. And so we don't know totally how to feel. We know a lot about our thoughts and our interpretation and our analysis and the conclusions that we're trying to draw and the why of how we feel, the why about what we're feeling, but not actually the feeling themselves. And this is the answer to your other question then, is how do you know that you might be grieving? How do you know that you might be facing a loss, but not really paying attention to the feelings underneath there? Is when we have incessant thoughts about the same thing over again, or we have behaviors that we're trying to motivate ourselves to do. We want a result in our life, and we keep getting stuck with the same pattern of not actually able to actualize it. This is where it becomes in there. We need some movement within some of these unresolved feelings that are existing inside. Because in some ways, our thoughts do create our feelings, but feelings, emotions, create our behaviors and our results in our life. Behind our why are emotions. Behind the things that we desire to do is feelings. Our emotions are things that we want to feel. And a lot of times we're motivated by feelings we don't want to have, which create then behaviors and actions and results that we're not excited about. And it's our incessant thoughts about those feelings. We do not drown in our feelings. We drown in our thoughts about our feelings. But if we can actually learn to feel them, allow the body to express. Okay, let's talk about that. So feelings live in the body. Feelings express through the body. Feelings express through the sensations of the body. Well, the body's like our best friend. Our body is our most loyalist friend. It is with us throughout this whole life. And in some ways, we all kind of treat our bodies terribly. Mind over matter, man up, right? Oh, push through. These are so many ways that we talk about our body. Oh, just be better, look better, exercise harder and stronger. And we push and we push and we eat, and the food that we have and the snacks and the diets and the pressure and the push we put on our body to make it look or be the way we want it to be. In some ways, we're not only suppressing feelings, but suppressing the instinct and the natural intelligence of the homeostasis of physiology. And so, in some ways, what we want to do is allow ourselves to connect to the feelings of our body, to the sensations of our, to tend and befriend with our body. And this is how we connect to emotions in a very simple way. And it's actually just that simple. It's just that simple. And if we can think that sensations of the body are like flowers of a garden wanting to blossom and bloom, and we allow the nature's experience to allow that expression to come in without the, oh, I got a low back pain. Well, I lifted that thing the other day. Oh my God, I'm so weak. I'm such a weak person. I feel like I'm aging. I'm getting older now. Oh, maybe do I need surgery? I don't want surgery. Oh crap, could this be something more serious? I haven't had labs. I haven't had a doctor in a long time. But all the while, we've labeled our sensation in our back as pain, and thus our thoughts run with it. But if we just experience into the sensation of what is existing in our back, and so it's like, oh yeah, maybe an ache, maybe a throb. Oh yeah, there's a warmness there. As I feel into it, it feels diffuse, not sharp. It spreads. Oh, I could feel it into my belly, slightly into my hip. Oh sure, yeah. There's a warm sensation. It feels like it moves. It's interesting, when I feel into it, it slightly dissipates. I'm allowing the sensation to blossom. So we call this emotion phobia. It's based on Marion Greenspan's work called Healing Through Dark Emotions. And I love this line because emotion phobia is not that we don't feel emotions, is that we're actually afraid of the emotions themselves. And thus we're afraid to the body and afraid of the body sensations. So this is what we want to help people, is develop the courage. And so in grief work, we call it face, embrace, release. Being able to be present to courageously what is actually happening. Embrace it as if there's nothing wrong and that it's totally right. And through that, there's a release.
I've definitely had emotion phobia before.
Me too.
I've actually, like, every Christmas time of year when the St. Jude's Children's Research Center sends you those little, donation packets with the cute little kids with their bald heads on top, I would just see them, and like, I was so overwhelmed with my grief and whatever emotions I was feeling at the time about seeing that child that I had to just throw it out. I couldn't even look at it. It was so painful. Gosh, I didn't know there was an actual term for that. I'm really happy to hear that. AmarAtma, there are two very specific kinds of grief that I've been noodling on lately about, the first is a grief that comes from something that you thought you had, like a dream that you were obsessed with, but which was really only in your mind and had never been made material.
Okay.
And I don't mean like I'm a stalker and I'm in love with that woman, and although I guess that could be like part of an example of it. So it's essentially like an attachment to a dream that you think is real or that is going to be real in the future, and then all of a sudden realizing it's not there. And I'll tell you where this always comes up for me whenever I started a new relationship in my life. Like in the beginning of that relationship, when I would start painting a picture of who this person was and what my life was going to be like with them, and all of a sudden, like 8 months into the relationship, would start to realize, oh, that's not at all who this person is. I just got caught up in some delusion. And obviously this happens for people whenever they are starting their families as well, when things don't go the way that they planned. So this is a grief of something we actually didn't have in like material form ever, but we still experience it as a grief.
That's right. We call this the hopes, dreams, and expectation loss. The life that we envisioned to have, the life that we dreamed to have that did not come to pass. In some ways, we can say that this loss is what some people refer to as maybe midlife crisis or a third life crisis, where we worked so hard to get to a life we were wanting to create, and that the realization of not that life not coming to existence is a loss, and figuring out a way to recalibrate, because we might be burnt out, might be overwhelmed, might be exhausted by keeping up with the story we were trying to create, with the difficulty of being with what is. Very much so. Yeah. That's a core component of a loss. And a lot of times people feel that within their careers. Some people feel that in their retirement. Some people feel that financially. Some people feel that in relationships, as you mentioned. So this is a loss that can exist with many different aspects, or sometimes all three at the same time. A difficulty with their marriage, a difficulty with their financial situation, a difficulty with their career. All three can hit within that, and that becomes the crisis, the midlife crisis component, or that piece where it's like, whoa, that's so much. And interestingly, while all those are losses, there are so many feelings that come in within all of that. And so the nature of our grief work would then be to tease out and come into a relationship of what those feelings are underneath, to be able to allow space to express into the varying levels of those losses. And so what we might talk about as a primary loss versus secondary loss versus a minor loss versus a micro loss. We call that boulders, rocks, pebbles, or sand. Which one they carry weight, and so finding what that primary loss is and connecting to that. So it's very real.
Wow. This is really cool to hear all these terms for things that people feel all the time, and that someone's actually, there's a name for that. Okay. So the other thing, that aspect of grief that comes up is like, is it beneficial to actually go through the exercise of imagining that you're losing something? Like, is that almost as a tactic of desensitization? Sometimes I'll sit and I'll imagine losing my mother, because I love my mother so much, and I'll cry. And I don't know why I do this. I'll do it sometimes after a yoga practice or after I'm meditating. It'll just come to me and I'll be like, wow, I'm going to lose my mom someday. And I'll really start thinking about it. And then obviously it's imagination. It's not happened right now. But is there a benefit to doing that kind of like almost as like a training for when something actually happens, or does it just never make it easier?
Yeah, actually, so let's clarify that a little bit there. So that grief is called anticipatory grief. And that's a very real grief for aging parents, or something that's in anticipation for a loss. Like, I'm going to be changing jobs, or I know that my company is going to be sold, or I know that we're going to be moving in 6 months' time. There's an anticipation to the loss. So we have to pay attention to this, where the mind might hijack the heart. So you said the word desensitization. That's a real good head word and a good intellectual word. But for the heart, when it's even in anticipatory grief, the grief is real right now. It's as if the loss is happening right now. So we have to pay attention to the quantum nature of the heart, that the heart can be in the past, the present, and the future all at the exact same time. And so while there might be anticipatory grief for your mom, and there's a sort of protection, I hear that as the word desensitized, protecting yourself from the pain of when the actual loss occurs, I would say to you that you're feeling the loss of your mom in your anticipation of her maybe not being here. And in that way, it's not that we're desensitizing or protecting ourselves. That would say, let's get active and engaged within that grief and saying what it is. Because most of the people that come to see me are actually people who have lost somebody. It's by death. And they all tell me, let me say it this way. The people who come to me and are doing grief work around a loss that they've had in their life of a person, they say that they wish they had done grief work before they had passed away, because there's so many elements that they wanted to say or connect to or own within the relationship that they can't have now. So anticipatory grief is actually really special. feeling anticipatory grief for somebody that you may lose or something that you might lose allows us to own the relationship in a way we've never been able to. And there's a gift in that. And I wish we actually felt that more, because that would help us heal a relationship with a person that we might not have the element to do. We can still do grief work when a person has passed, but it can't be as dimensional into the way that we want to that way. So at the time of their departure or transition out of this world, it doesn't have to be felt with sorrow and loss. It can be with perhaps celebration and completion and excitement, because the feelings that you have been able to harness together in that anticipation brought you so much closer. And that is rich. That is the richest. And actually, perhaps for me, has been the greatest motivation to doing grief work, is associated with anticipatory grief. If we can own into that, oh, we can do so much sweet work, because we know our families are where a lot of our, stuff are, like our emotional stuff, our triggers, our wounds. And if we can arrive into a different space of doing the energy, not necessarily confronting the person, it doesn't actually have to be in relationship to that person at all. It can be done through our work together and through the transformation and the growth and moving through those feelings that have been sort of harbored and held with maybe resentment or protection or boundary. Oh, we can do so much that could transform a relationship in the sweetest way. It's really quite spectacular. Thank you for bringing it up.
Thank you. Well, I guess is the goal not to feel grief?
So peace, internal peace, my belief when doing grief work with people, comes from a confidence of being able to be comfortable with the uncomfortable. Emotions are a natural part of our humanity. And in our protection or desensitize or buffering or seeking pleasure over our pain, our minimizing, our invalidating, our compartmentalizing is actually creating more displeasure and pain in our life, let alone disharmony and disease within the body. And so our goal is actually to face, embrace, and release. Be comfortable with the uncomfortable. Learn about emotional resiliency. Learn about naming and feeling emotions, becoming comfortable and confident in our ability to do so. Because grief, it draws us into our heart. Grief forces us to connect to our emotions. And what unresolved grief evolves into is our resistance to the natural process. Then we think incessantly about it and we cope and create behaviors around it. Oh, I just had a loss of a partner. I had a rejection. Oh, I never want to feel that pain again. So now I've created a barrier to love, a barrier to authenticity, and a barrier to intimacy. But yet those are the things that give me a sense of aliveness. But if we can arrive into that comfortably, softly, sweetly, gently, and learn a life skill around emotions, not be robotic, but feel and be that. Oh, all the things that we're looking for in our life can be there.
So is that what you mean when you said earlier about how perfectionism kind of is one of the reactions to grief?
Yeah, so we try to cope with many ways. We cope with perfectionisms, we cope with busyness, we cope with replacing losses by getting something else. Oh, I lost something, let me get a new car. I want a new toy. We buffer with many different ways. And in the grief work that I do in grief recovery method, we call these STIRBs, short-term energy relieving behaviors. And we do that, and anything can then be a STIRB. Food can turn into a STIRB. Sex can turn into a STIRB. Exercise can turn into a STIRB. Gambling, addictions, these are the foundations to the development of addictions for us. And so these are the ways. When we have emotion phobia and we're not confident with being comfortable with these uncomfortable feelings, will lead us to suppress and cope with by trying to take away pain, and thus becomes our identity, is we become what we are trying to avoid ourselves from. And that is heavy work. And sometimes, the grief work I do with people is helping them to let go of an identity that they fully cultivated in regards to that. That's so big for people. I have developed a whole identity around coping with this stuff. Who am I if I'm not protecting myself constantly from my pain? Oh, it's so rich. It's so beautiful. It's poetic.
Okay, this is kind of a weird question. Like, who does deal with grief well? Who have you seen are the people who inspire you that you're like, they got it figured out?
Few and far between, I'll be honest. Very few and far between. I think Brene Brown does this exceptionally well, and she teaches it exceptionally well. I think that what Brene Brown is doing with the Atlas of the Heart and her series, her Netflix special, her books, her talks, are really helping us understand shame as a barrier to vulnerability, connection, and intimacy. I might say that my role is, if peace is our goal, then she says that connection was my goal, and I became a shame researcher. For me, it's like if inner peace is our goal, then I became a grief worker. And so she speaks to it exceptionally well.
What about, like, it's funny, when I asked the question, I actually meant, like, I see why you went there actually, but I was actually thinking more about, like, if you've ever seen a person go through a loss, like in a hospital, or, kind of that, like, I don't know, I just feel like sometimes it's people you don't expect to really have it all figured out.
I think that's part of it. Yeah, I think that we have to recognize the messiness. So what I hear you asking in that question is, who have you seen that has done it well that kind of surprised you?
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that the question?
Yeah.
I'll answer it in two parts. The people that I work with are really amazing people, phenomenal people, but they come from various political backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, cultural experiences, age. They come from varying different places. But what's extraordinary about each one of them is courage. And it's so remarkable to see how people will arrive to the courage of their heart. It's almost like the desperation of feeling so crappy is just done. I can't do it anymore. And there's finally a readiness to transition to another way of looking and feeling. They've lost jobs, they've lost relationships, they've lost their health, and they said, I cannot do this anymore. And that is the rich experience of being with these people. It's like I'm in love with them. They're so beautiful and what they're doing and their courageous ability to arrive in there. And so, in some ways, it's an inherent part of each of us, something that I learned called the human spirit, the strength of the human spirit. It's remarkably within each of us, but it takes one major ingredient, courage. And I'll speak to this now in the second part. I spent a lot of time around really tragic deaths in the hospital. Tragic deaths. Wailing and screaming and yelling and praying and just in the absolute visceral experience of pain and loss. Huge and heavy. And the ones who were in celebration, the ones who were in a place of peace, which were few and far between, are the people who had done their advanced directives. The people who had talked about loss, the people who had talked about death, the people who had faced the experience of our impermanence and had conversations around medical powers of attorney, had conversations around, when this happens, this is what we plan to do, talked about funerals. It gets a little bit morbid, but this is the death doula part of me speaking, is that part of ourselves that recognizes and courageously comes to a relationship that we are not going to live forever. So what matters most? And that becomes the life hack, is using death as the greatest teacher. And the people who had done that in the hospital setting, it was a treasure. I mean, every relationship, every family was special in their own way. But I was in awe of the ones who had taken some time out of their life to have deep and hard conversations, uncomfortable conversations. And when death arrived, there was sadness, there was grief, there was loss, but there was also amazing conversations around love and beauty and connection and quirkiness and the imperfections and the funness. It wasn't bound by regret and disappointment, which are the two most prominent emotions when loss occurs. The feelings of disappointment, which is the stuff of the future, right? The things I wish I could have had Then were hopes, dreams, and expectations, and the regrets, the things that I wish were different, better, or more. So those are the powerful expressions there. So in honesty, I think it's with everyone because it's the human spirit that's within all of us. And I'm in love with the human spirit. It's remarkable when we allow ourselves to arrive at that place, the transformation, the growth that can come from it. I think that's what makes the world a truly better place.
Final question today. What does the wisdom of the body mean to you?
It's our link to our human spirit. The wisdom of our body is something that we can rely on, something that we can take and bathe in and connect to. And by allowing and being present to, the body will share with us the truth. The body will share with us the wisdom. The body will share with us as a compass, our true north.
Thank you so much for being here today. I feel more courageous after talking with you. And I don't know if that's a typical byproduct of dealing with this. Even though we didn't really get into a whole lot of my own personal stuff, I would imagine that going into it would be very empowering for people. And yeah, I really like this idea of working with anticipatory grief, and maybe that's something that we can collaborate on related to that as well. So I just want to thank you so much for being here and sharing your story and sharing your experience. And I know my audience is really going to love hearing about this.
I absolutely grateful for the invitation to speak with you, Heather. I love our collaboration, and this was really enriching. I feel like so enriched by this conversation. And if you're left with feeling courage and empowered, oh yeah, when we have a conversation around grief and we're left with that, that's what we want. That's the vibe.
Cool. That's so cool. How can people get in touch with you? Because I would suspect there's someone listening right now who wants to learn more about what you do.
Absolutely. I'm pretty active on social media, especially Instagram. At AmarAtma Coaching is available there. AmarAtmaCoaching.com is the website, and info@AmarAtma Coaching is the email address. Those are the different ways that you can reach out to me. Yeah, I'd be really honored to support or have a more in-depth conversation with people. This is my work. I do one-to-one private coaching and offer 30-minute initial consultations for folks as well to see if the services that I provide are right for where people are at and what they need. And, we can kind of explore and get a sense of what is that grief and loss, and is it grief and loss that we're experiencing? Because, if it's something, we want to be able to have the movement to it. And when it's misidentified grief, then we're kind of stuck in it, and we want to be able to get movement. And so if it's grief, yeah, let's do the work. Let's be awesome about this.
Yeah, grief is sticky, huh? Let's unstick that grief.
Let's unstick it.
Oh, man. Thank you so much for being here. It's been lovely.
Thank you, Heather. Appreciate it so much.
I want to thank you for listening to this show. It brings me great pleasure to provide this content to you. I also want to let you know that I'll be making some very amazing announcements soon. And if you're not already on my email list, then I encourage you to go over to my website and subscribe to my email list so that I can keep you informed about these announcements that are going to be coming up very soon. So my website is heathergrish.com. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. And I look forward to getting these important announcements to you very soon and connecting. Thank you for tuning in and dropping in with us today. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. I really want to hear your feedback. To learn more about my work, visit heathergrish.com. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. And meet me here next time on The Wisdom of the Body.